What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. And if you've been following the NBA, you know that James Harden is now a Brooklyn Net, and that forms the big three of KD, Kyrie, and Harden. And those three guys teaming up, that really got me thinking, what are the best big threes in NBA history? So today, that's what we're going to be looking at, the top 10 big threes to ever play in the NBA. Now, for this rankings, I will value championships, individual skill, how good they were at their peak, as well as longevity. And that criteria will all contribute to where I rank each big three. And with that being said, let's start the video. So at the number 10 spot, I have the big three of Isaiah Thomas, Joe Dumars, and Dennis Rodman. And this trio spent 7 years together. They won 2 championships and had 3 finals appearances. And during this run, Isaiah Thomas as well as Joe Dumars were named the finals MVP of those teams when the Pistons beat the Blazers and the Los Angeles Lakers. Now this trio, as well as the Pistons team, they were a defensive team and they had a defensive identity, and that really started with Joe Dumars and Dennis Rodman, two of the best defensive players in the NBA. Joe Dumars was a perennial all-defensive team member, and Dennis Rodman was always in the mix for the Defensive Player of the Year award. And at this point, Dennis Rodman, he was at his peak and his absolute prime, and he could really guard 1 through 5. Now, the best player out of this big three was no doubt Isaiah Thomas, who during this run was the second best point guard in the NBA, only behind Magic Johnson, the greatest point guard in NBA history. And at their peak, this team was absolutely dominant. During the 1989 playoffs, they had a 15-2 record, and the only 2 games they lost were to the Bulls in the Eastern Conference Finals. So that is why I have this Pistons Big Three at the number 10 spot. Now, moving on to number 9, we have the Big Three of Shaq, Kobe, and Robert Horry. And for this list, I really questioned putting them on there, as they really weren't a trio or a Big Three. It was really the duo of Shaq and Kobe, but that duo was just so dominant and so great, I could not leave them off this list. So Robert Horry, he's kind of here by default as a third option. Even though he was a role player, he was a very good role player and a very good clutch time player. And this big three was together for 6 years, and they won 3 championships, all those being consecutive. Now, for this run, you had Shaq at his absolute peak and his absolute apex, the most dominant version of Shaq, putting up 38 to 40 points per game in the finals and just wreaking havoc across the entire NBA. Now, you also had Kobe, who was evolving and becoming a more mature player, and he was even emerging as a superstar and a great player. And Robert Horry, like I said before, he was an extremely clutch player who hit some really big shots for this Lakers team. And very quickly, I just want to put into perspective how dominant these Lakers teams were. In the 2000 playoffs, they had a 15-7 record. In the 01 playoffs, they had a 15-1 record. And in the 02 playoffs, they had a 15-4 record. They were absolutely running through the entire NBA, and there was no competition for this big three when they were at their absolute peak. So up next at number 8, we have the big three: LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh. And this big three is very unique for a couple of reasons, as they're really the first ever big three that was constructed mainly through free agency, as LeBron and Chris Bosh made their way down to South Beach to team up with D. Wade. And this was a very controversial move at the time, and even till this day, it's a pretty hot topic of discussion. Now, this big three in only 4 years had 4 finals appearances and 2 championships, those being back-to-back. And the expectations for this team were absolutely sky high, and them winning 2 championships, in my opinion, was actually kind of disappointing. And I think what really holds me back from putting this big three higher is how they performed in the 2011 finals, losing to the Dallas Mavericks as the overwhelming favorites. Also in the 2014 finals, D. Wade and Chris Bosh had really regressed, and they really weren't the same players they were back in 2011, and they got run off the floor by the San Antonio Spurs. But I mean, all in all, this Heat team was a great team and a great big three. Now, moving on to number 7, we have Jordan, Pippen, and Horace Grant. And this big three was together for 6 years. They won 3 championships, all 3 of those being consecutive. And for this big three, MJ was at his absolute peak, and I think this is the best version of MJ, the 91-93 version, where he won 3 championships. Pippen was also at his peak athletically as well as physically, and he was a dominant two-way player. And the guy who gets lost in the mix is Horace Grant, as at the time, he was a borderline all-star and a very, very good player. And this big three fought through some very, very tough times, and they really grew up together and became champions, eventually overtaking the Detroit Pistons. Now at number 6, we have our first old school big three, that being Bill Russell, Bob Cousy, and Tommy Heinsohn. And this big three was together for 7 years, and they made the finals every single year, winning 6 championships, including 5 straight. And at this time, Bill Russell was at his absolute peak as the best defender and the most impactful player in the NBA. Bob Cousy at the beginning of this run was the best point guard in the NBA, but near the end, he kind of became a role player and a really good veteran piece. And Tommy Heinsohn, he was the do-it-all glue guy who just did the dirty work and was a really great teammate, as well as a really great defensive player. Now, what really holds me back from putting this big three in my top 5 is that Bob Cousy, he really declined in their later years, and the Celtics team had a ton of talent. It's really hard to call this a big three. It really was a big 5. All 5 of the Celtics starters were really integral pieces, and in a way, it's kind of similar to Shaq, Kobe, and Robert Horry, as there really isn't a defined big three. It's really one guy in Bill Russell, surrounded with a lot of talent and a lot of great players. So that is why I have this big three at the number 6 spot. So looking ahead to the number 5 spot, I have Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and Robert Parish. And this big three was together for 12 seasons. They won 3 championships and made the finals 5 times. And they were a part of the greatest rivalry in NBA history. And these 3 guys, Bird, McHale, and Parish, at their absolute peak, I would say was the best big three in the NBA. As Bird, he was the best player, Kevin McHale was the best power forward, and Robert Parish was a top 5 center. And when talking about the 80s Celtics, everyone always goes to Larry Bird as he was their best player. But I would argue their most important player was Kevin McHale, who at the time, like I said, was the best power forward in the entire NBA, and his post moves were ahead of his time. And any given night, he could give you 25 and 10 like it was nothing. I also think Robert Parish was a really underrated player, as he's a great center for his time. Now, the one thing that holds me back from putting this big three higher is that Bird and McHale had some really devastating injuries toward the end of this run, but besides that, this big three is one of the best of all time. So moving on to number 4, we have the big three of Tim Duncan, Tony Parker, and Manu Ginobili. And this big three was together for 14 years. That is the longest any big three has been together on this list, and during this time, they won 4 championships and made the finals 5 times. And I think it goes without saying that Tim Duncan, he is the greatest power forward of all time. Tony Parker, the top 5 point guard of the 2000s, and Manu Ginobili is one of the best 6-man in NBA history. Now, the weird thing about this big three that people forget is that Duncan, when they started in 03, he was an established superstar, but Tony Parker, he was in his 2nd year, and Manu Ginobili, he was a rookie. And throughout the years, they would grow, and they would kind of reach their peak in the 07 season as they won the championship, when all those players were at their relative peaks. And by far, the most impressive thing about this big three is their longevity and their sustained greatness. Like I said, this big three was together for 14 years. That is an astonishing amount of time for 3 players to be together, and the chemistry these guys had was off the charts. And it really all came together in the 2014 season, as the 2014 Spurs, in my lifetime, are the best passing team I have ever seen. And that is the epitome of team basketball, and the big three of Duncan, Parker, and Ginobili, they were at the center of that success. Now, getting into the top 3, at number 3, I have Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and James Worthy. And this big three spent 6 years together. They won 3 championships, and they went back-to-back once. And if you know anything about basketball, Magic Johnson, he's the greatest point guard of all time. Kareem is one of the greatest centers of all time, if not the greatest. And James Worthy is one of the most underrated players of his time. And the very unique thing about this Lakers Big Three is that each of these players won a Finals MVP when they were together. Nobody else on this list can say that. And this Lakers team was the best team of the 80s, and they made the finals every time but 1 year. And they were a perennial 60-win team, and they absolutely dominated the Western Conference as well as the entire NBA. And I think the 87 Lakers, that was when all these players kind of reached their relative peaks, as Magic was the best point guard. Kareem, he was kind of over the hill, but he was still really solid. And James Worthy was entering his prime. And that 87 Lakers team was so dominant, going 65-17 and having a 15-3 record in the playoffs, one of the best of all time. Now, the one thing that I kind of alluded to was Kareem falling off near the end of this run, and that, in my opinion, is what holds this Lakers team back from being at the 2 spot or even the 1 spot. So at the number 2 spot, I have Kevin Durant, Steph Curry, and Klay Thompson. And this Big Three was together for 3 years, and they won 2 championships back to back. Kevin Durant and Steph Curry at the time were both top 3 players, and Klay was a top 3 shooting guard and one of the best 3-and-D and two-way players in the game. And this team, much like the 2011 Heat, they were absolutely hated and they were the villains of the NBA. But despite that, this Warriors team in their first year went 67-15 and had a 16-1 record in the playoffs. And out of this entire list, this is the only Big Three where all 3 players averaged over 20 points per game. And this Big Three's reign of terror, it only came to an end due to injuries of Kevin Durant and Klay Thompson. Besides that, this team, they would have three-peated and they would have gone down as possibly the greatest Big Three in NBA history. So finally, we get to the number 1 spot, where I have the Big Three of Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, and Dennis Rodman. And this Big Three was together for 3 years, and they won 3 championships, all being consecutively. And at this time, MJ, he was the best player in the NBA, the best scorer. Dennis Rodman was the best rebounder and an all-defensive player. Scottie was the best defender at the small forward position. He was an all-defensive team member and one of the best all-around players in the entire NBA. Now, we all know how great Jordan is offensively, as he really carried the Bulls' offense, but defensively, all 3 of these guys, Jordan, Pippen, and Rodman, they were elite defensive players. And Rodman, while he wasn't in his prime, he was still a great defender and a great hustle player. And Pippen, as you guys know, was one of the most versatile players in NBA history, and Jordan in his own right was a really good defender. And when talking about this Big Three, you really can't say much that's already been said. I mean, they were a top 5 defense, a top 5 offense, and during their 3-year run, they had impressive records going 72-10, 69-13, and 62-20. I mean, what more can you ask for? 3 years, 3 championships, and another three-peat for the GOAT, Michael Jordan. So that right there was the end of my list of the greatest Big Threes in NBA history. I thought it was a pretty interesting topic and a pretty relevant topic given James Harden, Kevin Durant, and Kyrie all teaming up on the Brooklyn Nets. So I thought it'd be fun to give you guys my top 10 list. So as always, let me know in the comments what you guys disagree with, what you agree with, what you would change, what you would keep the same, anything like that. I'll try to respond to and just give you guys some further insight, as it is kind of hard to fit all the details in a short YouTube video. So with that being said, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys next time.